Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. Over the past 24 hours, we have been getting results from two regional elections in Germany, the states of Thuringia and Saxony. And the results, it is fair to say, have been historic. The AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, came first in Thuringia with over 30%. That's the first time they've won one of these absolutely crucial regional elections, and a very, very close second in Saxony. So already that's an enormous result. Alongside, we've had the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, a completely new political party, doing extremely well, something like 16%, 12% in those two states. Meanwhile, the parties that actually run Germany, the parties that form the federal government in coalition, have not performed at all. In some cases, they nearly lost their deposit, nearly coming under 5%. So something very dramatic is happening at the heart of Europe. And we've got a couple of our favourite analysts to try to understand exactly what that is. First up, we'll be talking to Katja Hoyer, a UnHerd contributor and, of course, author of Beyond the Wall, I would say the definitive book about East Germany, where she grew up. After that, we'll be talking to Thomas Fazi, and he has just written rather an amazing essay for us about Sarah Wagenknecht. So with Katja, we're going to explore what exactly is going on, why these people are voting in East Germany for these particular political parties, trying to get to the bottom of, are they far right? Are people obsessing about the wrong thing, or what's actually happening beneath the surface? And once we get Thomas on, we will have a bit of a closer look at the Sarah Wagenknecht phenomenon and whether her strange brand of left conservatism could be a sign of things to come across the rest of Europe. First up, Katja, welcome to UnHerd.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So just put us in perspective, first of all. There was some sense that because the AfD has not come first in both regional elections, maybe it wasn't as bad as people were expecting or whatever, but big picture, this is quite a stunning result, isn't it? And it shows that politics are changing in Germany.
Yeah, I was quite surprised yesterday watching some of the German sort of news shows on this and talk shows on this, how there was almost immediately this kind of breathing out relief. You know, it will be possible to form coalitions without the AfD in it. As it now turns out, since the results kind of became a bit clearer overnight, that's possible in both states, but it's quite difficult. So whichever way you look at it, it's basically made the AfD a major political player because either it's a huge coalition party and it's standing against very, very unstable and quite complicated coalitions, basically, that would range from the Conservative Party all the way to two far-left parties, potentially. So, you know, mix all of those together into 3- and 4-way coalitions standing against what is now a very, very strong AfD party, and you end up with a very interesting and difficult political situation.
Yeah, so it's very precarious, isn't it? Because the government is formed from three more sort of mainstream parties, the CDU, the Liberal Party, and the Greens, and they've been around for a long time. But very few people are voting for them in these regional elections. So there's this weird situation where the government, the coalition parties of the government, are getting very, very small numbers in votes. How is that going to play out?
Yeah, that's right. So it's the SPD that's in the coalition, the Social Democrats under Olaf Scholz, who are basically leading in Berlin. But they got very low votes, as you say, in both Saxony and Thuringia. They were actually frightened that they might not even get in because there's a sort of hurdle of 5% that you need to cross to be able to even make it into parliament. So they were almost relieved that they got sort of 7 or so percent, which is ridiculous given that is the main party at the moment in government in Berlin, to be relieved about that. So hopefully the message is very clear in Berlin that the people, not just in the East, I think across Germany, are quite fed up with the politics that is currently playing out in Berlin, federal politics, and that this is a clear message. Because the problem so far has been that people have been telling people in the East in particular that, you know, their vote's undemocratic. If they're not voting for the mainstream parties, it's a vote against democracy, which is, of course, a complete nonsense. Democracy doesn't die, you know, in the ballot box. It seems an odd thing to say to people. You cannot express your vote democratically by voting democratically.
Yeah, also worth pointing out that it was very high turnout. Right, so this is the opposite of democracy dying. This is democracy kind of reawakened. I think it was 74% or more in those regional elections, which is high. So people are not giving up on democracy. They are voting, and they're voting for something different.
No, absolutely, and that's what I've been arguing in the German press as well. You can't tell people, to kind of save democracy and then tell them that they're doing it wrong by going and voting. If anything, if the centrists do want to stay in power and they want to win people back before the federal elections next year, which are around about in 1 year basically now, then they need to think about why it is that so many voters have turned away from them and why they're turning left and right. Quite literally in this case for alternatives. I mean, that's why the party called itself that, because it was basically saying when it was founded in 2013 that it wants to be an alternative to mainstream politics in Germany.
And that message is obviously really hitting home in those parts of Germany, but even among demographics that you might be surprised about, like young people. I mean, I was looking at a chart this morning that among 18 to 24-year-olds, at least this is per the exit poll, it may not be exactly like this, the AfD did even better than among other generations. So young people, whilst in this country, young people are still voting traditional centre-left, not true in places like Thuringia and Saxony.
No, and I mean, people have underestimated that for too long. I think there's always been an assumption that young people want sort of green and left-wing politics, and that shock already came during the European elections for the European Parliament in June, when also it was evident that people in that demographic had voted for the AfD in large numbers as well. I think the issue that people forget is that these young people, especially in the East, they also live in areas that have demographically, declined basically in recent years, that have had massive change through immigration, particularly kind of what they call irregular immigration, meaning illegal immigration, basically immigration that hasn't been controlled in any shape or form. So there's now higher crime rates, and they're measurable. That's not a sort of, prejudice or anything. So basically young people feel that their areas where they live aren't necessarily safe anymore. They've changed. They don't really have the job opportunities that they want, apprenticeships and so on. So they are also not going to continue to just vote for the sake of it, basically carry on voting for the same parties.
So let's just talk in a little bit more detail about why this is happening. You say it's sending a clear message. So it's an anti-immigration message, first and foremost. I think we can actually put a chart up. It says here, among people who think that immigration is the major driving force of their vote, 42% of AfD voters feel that it's their number one issue, compared to just 17% for the Sarah-Wagenknecht party, 15% for CDU. So AfD voters definitely driven by anti-immigration feeling. What else? Is it just immigration or are there other issues?
No, I mean, the AfD tries to drive its vote through that. So they basically called the other day, one of their leaders called immigration the mother of all problems, and was basically launching into a long lecture on why housing and education and all the other issues all go back to it. I don't think that's how most voters see it. Immigration is a key issue, but not the only one. Another thing that people are just really fed up with is being told what to do, and people in the East are how to think and how to speak. And people in the East are particularly, I think, sensitive towards that. I hear a lot there when I go back that people say things like, it's just like back in the old days when we were in East Germany and the regime was kind of giving us the vocabulary with which we are supposed to speak in public. So basically, it's also an anti-woke, if you will, vote in lots of ways because of the kind of mainstreaming of specific language that is being used that is kind of further and further detached from how people speak, but they're expected to speak in the same way.
You think memory of the Stasi, basically, memory of being spied on and being kind of told what to say in a semi-police state, is actually making East German voters more worried about the sort of political correctness, so-called woke language police?
Yeah, it's not the Stasi as such, more that the regime, say, in schools and in public and in, the way that you were supposed to speak when you're not in your own home, was expecting very particular things. So, for example, rather than calling the Berlin Wall what it was, a wall, they'd call it an anti-fascist protection barrier. It's a completely ridiculous thing to say. And yet you expect people to kind of parrot that and repeat it, and people would, for the sake of their own peace and whatever would adopt that language in public but would speak differently in private. And that reminds lots of Germans today about the way that, they're not supposed to say certain things, even though they think them. And they then sit in the pubs and at home and at work and say those things to the people that they trust, but they wouldn't speak the same way in public. And that rings very different bells in East Germany compared to the same thing annoys people elsewhere, but I think it brings back memories for older East Germans in particular of things that they feel they've already seen.
So we've got immigration with crime kind of associated with that. We've got a general sense of sort of anti-woke, anti-politically correct. I guess the third one which needs mentioning is environmental issues, or the kind of the green movement. It feels like this is also a rebellion against that. I think I've got a number here that 75% of AfD voters oppose giving priority to climate policy over economic growth. I mean, Germany's had a bit of a sort of self-sabotage story with regard to its industrial base, and a lot of that is based in East Germany, or at least it relies on that. Is that a correlation we should draw?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you saw in the European elections already, I haven't seen the figures for this one yet, but the AfD basically won the working class vote in June across Germany. And for historical reasons, having lived in a very industry-heavy working class based society, there's just a lot more of that going on in the East. So basically the proportion of working class people is much higher. You can kind of compare it, I'd say, maybe to the north of England in terms of what's happened to a deindustrialization and closing of coal mines and so on. So that sort of thing is very acutely felt in the East, and it's visible, that change, because it's also very agricultural areas, so perfect for wind farms. So basically, over what's happened over the last 3 decades, really, since reunification, is that the industry's been closed down, and instead people have been seeing these kind of sort of wind farms being put up everywhere and solar farms and so on. And if you put these two things together, people kind of immediately draw that connection. They say, what's happening to me at the same time as how the landscape is basically changing around me. There's a connection there, and so for that reason alone, there's a lot of hostility there towards these policies, and the Greens have almost become the antichrist basically for people on the centre right and the far right. Even the centre right parties are basically sort of mainly drawing support now, also by saying it's these green policies that we don't want anymore.
Politically speaking, this is just yet more proof that the whole German establishment response to the threat from these new parties is failing, right? I mean, I think that's hard to argue with now. This whole sense that you need to demonize their voters, call them extremists, put them on the fringes, refuse to cooperate with them, that is not working. They are growing. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what I always reject a little bit is people comparing the AfD to other populist parties, because there are extremists in it, and there's no denying that. But for a long time, the voters and the party have basically been equated. So people have said, well, you've got a person here who's on trial for using neo-Nazi slogans, and so this means that the third or so of Thuringian...
Höcke, the leader in Thuringia.
Björn Höcke, yeah, in Thuringia. So the fact that they've basically voted for the AfD isn't necessarily a vote for him. You can see his popularity ratings are actually quite low, despite the fact that the parties are very high. So this is people voting for issues, for particular concerns that they have, rather than for the rhetoric that's coming from the top. And you're right, basically, to then tell people that they can't express their concerns about immigration, about green policies, about economic change, about all of these things in their vote, means that you're effectively not changing your own policy or responding to what people are telling you. And I think that's beginning to change now, because I think that's beginning to sink in, given the drastic nature of the way that the vote shifted. So we've just seen an announcement from a centre-left government that they want to crack down on illegal migration basically to Germany, and the language that they've used has really been quite stark in terms of what they have been saying about immigration, where it's all about giving our citizenship more easily and welcoming people to the country. And that's now changed towards, well, we need to deport criminals more quickly. The first plane to Afghanistan with 28 criminals, rapists, basically people who've raped children and so on, has just been sent back to Afghanistan as a way of showing people we're trying to do this. But that's quite remarkable. That's a really a sort of swift turnaround, not least because of the stabbings that we've seen in Solingen as well, but it was also because of the elections.
So actually that you could say is a positive sign, like whatever's going to happen at the voting level, some of this message is being heard by the establishment, maybe too little, too late. Can I ask, this whole controversy as to whether the AFD is far right or not, I noticed the Times of London were calling them hard right this morning as opposed to far right. It's this never-ending question. In a way, from what you're saying, it's the wrong question because, there probably are some extremist people within it, but whether or not to classify them as far right or not, it misses the point because the voters, you can't have 30+% of the population all being far right. Or unacceptable, because that is almost by definition seems preposterous. How do you kind of negotiate this controversy? I find whenever we have it in any article, it becomes the thing that's talked about in the comments. People are really very upset if you use that term. What's the best way to approach it?
I always insist on doing that because I do think when you have people like Björn Höcke in it, and not just in it, but actually running certain regional chapters of it, they are different from, say, what's going on in Italy. Or elsewhere, and also because there is always this kind of Nazi background in Germany, and it's not something that I'm saying as a historian, is something that they allude to. So Höcke, for example, having just been on trial for using the slogan "Everything for Germany" deliberately. By the way, this isn't a coincidence where he says, I accidentally used this, or it's just a slogan that sounds the same. And when he was actually charged for that, he then put "everything for Thuringia," which is obviously not illegal, but a very similar phrase, as the title of his manifesto deliberately to kind of get as close to that as he can and use that as this kind of sign that he's fighting against this. But the point is that the voters are really trying to vote on issues, on things that concern them. I've always said this whole debate around the AFD itself is misplaced because what you need to look at is why people vote for them. And that's really the bigger thing when, you look at how they've risen in the polls over the last really sort of year or so. It's not suddenly that people wake up one morning and think, I want to turn up at a rally and do a Hitler salute. It's the fact that people are fed up with certain issues. They don't feel that the mainstream parties are catering to them. And interestingly, when the CDU, the Conservative Party, has just ramped up its rhetoric on immigration very, very strongly in the wake of the stabbings that we've had in Solingen, immediately the AFD dropped a little bit in the polls, and the Conservatives rose, because effectively what was missing for years under Merkel was a centre-right option for people to vote for, because Merkel had pulled the Conservatives that used to occupy this spot so far to the centre that it left the entire right flank of the political spectrum wide open, basically, for the AFD as a relatively new party to step into. And so they really needed to look back to themselves and say, well, how is the political spectrum so unbalanced that we got sort of 3, 4, 5 options on the left, and on the right there's this great vacuum.
Final question for you, Katja, which is, I guess, the million-dollar question. Do you feel like this is sort of approaching the ceiling, or is this just a sign of things to come? I mean, do you think the march of these other parties, the Sarah Wagenknecht, the AFD, can just carry on? Can it become overall majorities? Can it lead the federal government in Germany? Or do you think this will remain a kind of powerful protest vote? What's your take?
I think that all depends on how the mainstream parties respond to it. So I think what Friedrich Merz has done, in terms of pulling the Conservative Party back to being a Conservative Party, will have a huge impact. They already won the vote basically during the European elections in pretty much all of West Germany, which is also remarkable, something that people haven't really commented upon. Used to be a race between them and the centre-left party, basically. And they also came second in a lot of the eastern states as well. And as you've just said, they basically won in Saxony right now as well. We talk about the AFD a lot, but actually the Conservative Party edged it just about, and they'll probably keep a Conservative leader in their state in Saxony. So I think that can work and pull voters back, because ultimately, as I say, most voters just want a centre-right conservative, old school, basically conservative party back, which, if that happens and it's back on the spectrum, may pull a lot of these voters back, I think, to it. The problem is that Merz himself isn't particularly popular. So, they basically lack somebody with a bit of charisma who can, just a little bit of something, a spark to them, who can say that he's not just a career, or she is not just a career politician, but actually kind of really cares about these issues and draw people back. That is their problem.
Katja, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you.
So that was Katja Hoyer, a friend of UnHerd and author of Beyond the Wall, I would say one of the definitive books about East Germany. We're joined now by Thomas Fazi, one of our favourite columnists, and himself a bit of an expert on Sarah Wagenknecht. He wrote a wonderful essay for us here at UnHerd over the weekend. Now, Sarah Wagenknecht is someone we didn't talk a lot about with Katja just there, but her party, the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, also did extraordinarily well in those two regional elections over the weekend. Thomas, tell us about Sarah Wagenknecht and the phenomenon around her.
Not only do we have Germany, a country that's long been known for having the most boring politics in the continent, long dominated by the two main parties, the center-right CDU-CSU alliance and the center-left PSD, now being the epicenter of Europe's populist revolt. I mean, this in itself is something that I think very few people would have predicted a few years ago. But even more interestingly, Germany is really the only country in Europe at the moment where the establishment is facing an anti, sort of a populist uprising, not just from the right, but also from the left. And so from the right, of course, in the form of the AFD, but also from the left in the form of this new party, the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, which can be described as a left populist or left conservative party, which was launched by Sarah Wagenknecht just a few months ago, which makes the results that she got double-digit results in both German states that went to the vote yesterday even more extraordinary.
I've got the numbers here. She ended up with 15.8% in Thuringia and 11.8% in Saxony. So it's not in the same scale as the AFD, which is over 30% in both regions, but it's still substantial, and if you put it together with the AFD, it shows very nearly a 50% block.
No, it's extraordinary. I mean, I think I can think of very few, if any, precedents for a party that is capable of obtaining these results just a few months after the party is launched. The AFD has been around for years now. Sarah Wagenknecht's party was literally just formed a few months before the European elections, and it's now one of the major political forces in the country. It's in Eastern Germany, it's de facto the third party now after the AFD and the CDU. This is absolutely extraordinary.
So specifically, Thomas, what differentiates her from the AFD? Because I know they kind of agree, they're both cold on immigration, they're not in favour of mass migration, they are culturally conservative and they're anti the woke stuff. Do they differ on Ukraine? Because the AFD is not especially supportive of the kind of Western campaign in Ukraine either, but is she just further on that, or what are the distinctions between those parties?
Well, I think there's two major distinctions. The first distinction is the social and economic agenda. Sarah Wagenknecht, as someone who's been on the left her entire life, she's been the main face and voice of the German radical left, as one of the leading voices, if not the leading voice of Die Linke, the radical left German party for many, many years. So she comes from the left, and that's a big part of her political agenda.
To put some meat on that, so that means what? That she's into a big state, she wants, spending, welfare, state intervention, support of industry, those kinds of things.
If you believe in preserving stability, if you believe in preserving communities, if you believe in preserving traditions, this can only happen where the state intervenes to rein in the excesses of capitalism, of the market. And so from her perspective, a left-wing economic policy, which doesn't necessarily mean big state, which sounds scary in itself. It just means that the state has to take a responsibility to protect and support working class people through pro-employment policies, pro-welfare policies, pro-social security policies. The state has a responsibility to promote employment, good employment for its people. And this is really the only way of preserving those values and those communities that conservatives themselves cherish. And I think this is something that really puts her aside from most populist parties today in Europe, which mostly focus their security agenda around controls on immigration and an opposition to the woke agenda. What Sara says is that you can't just frame security in terms of public safety, in terms of reducing crime, as much as that is important, of course. But, you have to frame security in broader terms, in terms of also offering economic security. And Sara would say even collective security in terms of pursuing or pushing back against what she describes as a very irresponsible, militaristic and policy that Germany, as other European countries, are pursuing at the moment vis-a-vis Russia.
So that's the second one. You said there were two differences. That's the second one then. So she goes further than the AfD in her skepticism about the kind of Western role in the Russia-Ukraine war. So what is it that she wants to do? She wants to cease all funding to Ukraine. She wants to, what, is it sort of Donald Trump style? She says she'll do a deal with Vladimir Putin in 24 hours, or what's her proposal?
She's often stated that this is a war that Ukraine cannot win, and that if we want to be friends of Ukraine, if we want to be friends of the Ukrainian people, the West should be supporting a diplomatic solution to this conflict. And this, of course, means no more arms deliveries to Ukraine, or at least arms deliveries conditional, at the very least, to Ukraine pursuing a diplomatic path, which is, of course, something that NATO has not been wanting to do until now, and doesn't seem inclined to do for the moment.
If we're trying to pass the kind of populist vote, it does look from these results like it's still very much the AfD, either twice or three times what the Sarah Wagenknecht vote is. So do you think we deduce from that her particular combination has a constituency, but the AfD formula, which is more of a kind of traditional right populist message, is going to do better? Or would you say that this is sort of just the beginning and we'll see more and more Wagenknecht-style voters?
Look, I mean, I wouldn't frame it in terms of a competition, of a populist competition between Sarah Wagenknecht and the AfD. One of the criticisms that's often leveled at Wagenknecht on the German right is that she's kind of crowding out the populist vote, that she's actually drawing votes away from the AfD, thus weakening the kind of populist / anti-establishment front. In fact, there's very little evidence for this. I think the evidence points to the fact that, since Sarah's party has appeared on the German political scene, AfD has, the AfD's polling has remained largely unchanged. So there's really not much evidence that she's drawing votes away from the AfD. All the evidence points to the fact that, in fact, what she's doing is drawing votes mostly from the center and even from the left, even from her former radical left party, Die Linke. And so this would, I think, suggest that she is actually broadening the populist front. She's not dividing it. She's not weakening it. She's broadening the populist front. And she's doing this. She's been capable of doing this, I think, partly because her message is, different, especially when it comes to economic policy, is different from the AfD, which, has what many would consider quite a neoliberal sort of mainstream approach to economic policy. But I think she's also perceived by large swathes of the German electorate who are really mad at the ruling coalition government, who are very, very critical of immigration, but nonetheless, don't feel comfortable voting for a party that clearly has, xenophobic and even racist elements in it, i.e. the AfD. And in fact, the data shows that she's actually drawing in a lot of voters from, as I said, from the center and from the left, who are very critical of immigration. There will always be a pool of voters that will not that won't feel comfortable voting for a quote unquote far right party like the AfD, but they will feel comfortable voting for a party that's perceived as being less extremist, quote unquote, as Sada's party is. And in fact, she's what's quite incredible is that again, the data shows that she's actually drawing in voters from a migrant background as well, who are also very concerned about immigration, or at the very least, whose economic concerns trump their migrant background. But these are people that I think would very unlikely be voting for the AfD.
Zooming out, what is your sense of what happens next? I mean, I asked Katja, and her conclusion was she thinks there's every chance that the sort of mainstream centre-right, as it's already starting to do, will learn the lessons and will start leaning in harder on things like immigration and will reabsorb some of those AfD voters. And she thinks the CDU could kind of come back. What's your prediction? I mean, what do you think will happen in Germany?
If the main opposition party, i.e. the CDU, is smart enough to learn the lessons from the message that voters are clearly signaling in Germany, and therefore starts to realign itself with what these parties are demanding, both the AfD, but also the Sarah Wagenknecht alliance in terms of economic policies. Then of course, we might witness a reabsorption of the electorate into a new redefined political mainstream. One alternative is that the CDU, especially, is kind of forced into alliances with parties that have very different ideological backgrounds from itself, i.e. Sarah Wagenknecht's party. There's talk of now maybe a government coalition in some German states between the CDU and Sarah Wagenknecht. We'll see if that happens. That would be that in itself would be one way of shifting policies of the CDU, maybe even against its will. Or, of course, I mean, there's always the possibility that at some point the right populist and the left populist front come together.
Because at the moment, she has refused that, right? So she is saying she will not go into coalition at any cost with the AfD. She's ruling that out, I suppose, to make it clear that she shouldn't be lumped together with them, and she wants to signal that she's different. But do you think that's the right call?
What we're experiencing in Western politics is completely new. I mean, this is a completely unprecedented phase in Western politics. All the parties and movements, and even ourselves, I would say, we're kind of exploring new paths as we go along. I think that the simple existence of a party like Sarah Wagenknecht's party is already signals that voters are really open to exploring new political paths. But this can only happen gradually. So what, for example, Sarah Wagenknecht's voters seem to be signaling is we are very pissed off with the mainstream, we're pissed off with the establishment, we're also very angry about immigration, but we're not comfortable voting for a quote-unquote far-right party. The question is, for how long will those labels hold? I mean, Sarah can't ignore the fact that that's one of the main reasons why people are voting her. I mean, there's one thing that you can't disregard in politics, it's your voters. And so clearly, I think she's making a tactical move, which is very understandable in rejecting the possibility of an alliance with the AfD now. But everything's in a flux. At some point, the demand from German voters might change. They might start signaling that, look, we are so mad at the establishment that what we want is for you to actually form a front with the AfD to go up against the establishment. I mean, that's definitely something that cannot be ruled out. It doesn't seem what her voters are demanding now, and so it's understandable that she's ruling that possibility out for now. We're in such a flux that could change very, very quickly. And so, the old is collapsing and something new is emerging, but that still has to, crystallize and solidify politically. We're very much in the flux of things.
Thomas, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was Thomas Fazi and just before him, Katja Hoyer, two UnHerd contributors throwing some quite different analysis around about yesterday's extraordinary result in Thuringia and Saxony. These are states in the heart of Germany, in the heart of Europe, that are showing complete political disruption. And as Thomas said there at the end, who knows what happens next. Thanks to both of them, and thanks to you for joining. This was UnHerd.